That person also handle restaurants, or how?
No, that position is aimed at addressing building code, health code, and zoning regulations, all of those, strictly for housing.
Does that position have a title?
It has had a moving title. I could give you one. It'll probably be different next week. It is the position that will enforce and educate and coordinate housing code issues in Amherst.
That'll be good.
We very much look forward to that.
Yeah.
Yes, so do we.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
No.
Okay. So in terms of scheduling, I already mentioned the zoning forum on January 4th. What did I do with my calendar? And I brought along for our benefit a calendar just so that we have something to look at as we talk about what our schedule is going to be for the spring. I would like for us to be more organized and more disciplined in our scheduling as we head into spring than we were this time around. We were working on a tight deadline for the fall town meeting and the preparation of the rezoning article, and I don't think that worked in our favor. So even though it seems like spring town meeting is a long way away, I say this like every cycle of town meeting. It seems like it's a long time away, and it just ended. But in fact, Springtown meeting begins on April 30th. The date has already been set. And the calendar that I've got here highlights our scheduled meeting dates between now and then. And there's really only 8 of them between now and when town meeting starts. Select Board, in fact, signs the warrant about a month before town meeting begins. That's on Friday, March 30th this year. So between now and the signing of the warrant, we have a total of 6 zoning subcommittee meetings scheduled. So I think we need to be disciplined and energetic in working on this and to bear that schedule in mind, and also to think about where we might want to have additional meetings. So my thinking at this point in terms of scheduling, because we already have a consensus that the rezoning, Village Center rezoning projects that we just dealt with are going to be important going forward. I would like to start right off on our meeting on the 18th. So the meeting on the 4th is essentially just dedicated to public comment, and we won't have any expectation of getting substantive work done there. But on the 18th, I would like to have a meeting that's specifically oriented at getting the folks who are interested in particularly North Amherst, but maybe South as well, asking them specifically to come in and have a sort of roundtable discussion so that we can hear people's ideas and concerns about the zoning as it stands, and to try to find ways of incorporating the ideas. We've heard interesting things from the people that live in the neighborhood, and we've heard a lot of expressions of desire for change. So I'd like to try to incorporate that, to specifically have a session where we hear that feedback, and to find ways to get it into the article. I am picturing, if we do that, if you guys agree with that, I am thinking about the idea of scheduling another meeting on January 25th, which is the following Wednesday, which would not be a normal meeting date for us, to act on that feedback and to begin the work of making changes to the article and thinking about what we can do to it. I think that it would be a mistake for us to wait until February 1st, which would be our next meeting after that date. I'd like to keep that momentum going and to make sure that our work is aimed more at the beginning of the cycle than at the end of the cycle, which was how we did it last time around. So thoughts on that approach as a general item, and then any specific scheduling issues with those dates that you guys might have. Rob?
That schedule is fine with me, but I have some ideas that I'd like to start talking about now, so that we're not waiting until the 18th to start thinking about this.
Sure.
Schedule seems fine to me.
Okay. So I said at the outset that I didn't want to get too much into the substance of the articles tonight, but I will hear ideas and general sort of outline level items that you might have. Okay, so in terms of staff, are you guys okay with that schedule? And in particular, the idea of scheduling a meeting on the 25th of January, which would not be a normal meeting date for us. We would probably have to do it somewhere else because I think that's a night that COMCOM would be meeting. COMCOM would be meeting in here. And
Yeah.
so if we're all good with that date, I'll look out to the audience also because we do want to involve the people who are interested in this and to, if there are any drastic problems with the schedule that I've laid out here, please feel free to let us know. And please do use the microphone also because,
That,
sure. Sure. Okay. Thank you. Our normal meeting schedule for both the zoning subcommittee and the planning board is the first and third Wednesdays of every month, and we anticipate following that schedule for the next few months. Sometimes we schedule extra meetings, and that's one of the things we're talking about here. So the meeting schedule that we're discussing now for January, or actually starting with December, we won't be meeting at our normally scheduled meeting 2 weeks from now, December 16th. That would have been the zoning forum normally, but we didn't have enough time to announce that. Chris is raising her hand to tell me that I might be wrong about that.
21st, I believe.
Oh, 21st.
December
What did I say?
You said 16th.
I said 16th. December 21st would be the normal second Wednesday meeting in December, and we will not be meeting. So our next meeting after tonight will be Wednesday, January 4th. That will be the zoning forum that we schedule on a semi-annual basis. We won't anticipate getting any work done ourselves that night. That's mostly dedicated to inviting people to come in here, tell us their thoughts and priorities on both the draft work list that we have put together and any other thoughts that people might have. So at 5 p.m. in this room, Wednesday, January 4th. Our next meeting after that will be Wednesday, January 18th. And as I've just laid out here, I would picture that being a meeting where we specifically invite all of you, people who are so interested in the work that we're doing, as well as those who aren't here tonight, to come in and have a discussion about your thoughts and ideas and concerns, to lay that out on the table at the beginning of the process so that we have a better idea of what your major concerns are. I mean, we already think we have a sense of what people's concerns are because we have heard them over the course of this process, but I want to have an opportunity to talk about them, both your concerns and your ideas for what we can do with the article. So that's the meeting that I picture happening on Wednesday, January 18th, also at 5 p.m., also in this room. The 25th, we're scheduling an out-of-cycle meeting, Wednesday, January 25th, which would be more of a working meeting for the subcommittee, not so much a public roundtable back and forth discussion, but an opportunity for us to act based on the feedback that we've received both from the zoning forum and from that roundtable discussion on the 18th. So that would be our first major working meeting to start to put the pieces together and to really talk in detail about the changes that we'd be making to the article. After that, our next regularly scheduled meeting would be Wednesday, February 1st, and following our normal first and third Wednesday meeting cycle after that. I won't try to plan additional meetings at this point beyond the next month or so, but it's possible that we would also have a meeting maybe in the 2-week period at the end of February and the beginning of March when there would be no meeting scheduled. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions about the process or the timing? Ms. Perot?
You say on the 25th that you'd be having a working meeting acting on the feedback that you got. Did you say out of sight?
No, I'm sorry, I said out of cycle. We have that's what I call it. We have first and third Wednesday, so anything that doesn't match that. It would also likely, that meeting on the 25th, which we haven't scheduled yet, it's likely that it would be out of sight in the sense that it wouldn't be in this room because the Conservation Commission meets on the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month, the Wednesdays that we don't meet. They meet in here at 7 p.m. So actually we probably could do a ZSC meeting.
do it if we were disciplined about time.
Yes. which we would make every effort to be. So no word yet on where it's going to be. It actually probably would be here, but you would need to check the town website for the scheduling details of that meeting. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Rob, would this be a good time for you to talk to us about the thoughts that you have?
Sure. So I'd like to consider a different approach to village center rezoning, a slightly different approach to village center rezoning than we did in the fall. And that is to separate the form-based code from any specific village center proposal. In other words, move form-based code in a separate article, move village center rezoning for Atkins Corners or wherever in a separate article. And the way I would do that is to make form-based code an element of existing village center zoning. So in other words, when we talk about village centers, we're talking about a set of uses and a set of dimensions, and why not also a set of form standards? So that's when we think of village centers, we're actually thinking of a form. I think many of us, and so I think most of the standards that were in the proposed Article 16 are general enough and obvious enough to be relevant to any village center. Now there would be some standards, for instance, the village residential standard that was proposed for North Amherst that would have to be separate. So I think that would not be a difficult thing. And then when we wanted to apply form standards would then automatically be applied to all our village centers that are zoned. And then if we wanted to extend that, it would be a matter of extending the zoning boundaries rather than creating a new form standard for the East Village or something. And I would couple that by creating a transfer of development rights provision in the zoning bylaw. I don't think that would be difficult to do. I looked it up, did some research on it. Falmouth has a very simple TDR provision. And what I would envision with that is you would be able to transfer density from areas that we want to protect, that we've already identified as wanting to protect, such as RO and RLD zones, or lands that are identified in the Open Space and Recreation Plan, or Chapter 61 lands. And so you would purchase those development rights and then transfer them to village centers or transfer them to the downtown. And I guess the way it would work in village centers is maybe we would increase the density or increase lot coverage. For downtown, it might be additional height or floors. And then I think we could consider a much more limited and tailored, and this would be in the future, not in the spring, a much more tailored and limited development modification article that might apply only to RG and RN districts. And I could imagine that we could design it in such a way that improvements made that we listed in our previous incarnation of that article, those improvements could earn points that could then be sold or transferred somehow to our TDR receiving zones of village center and downtown. So that way we're tying increased density in village centers and the downtown to specific conservation of land in outlying areas. I know that Amherst has always been and is continuing to preserve land, but people want to see explicit connections between proposals to increase density in a village center and saving other land. So I'm saying a form-based code article, a TDR article, and then individual village center rezoning articles where we just change the boundaries.
That's quite an ambitious.
Yeah, no, I don't. It
long-term
does sound like a
plan.
lot, but I don't think that would be that difficult to do.
So I do agree with the notion of separating up into separate pieces. One of the most obvious bits of feedback that we've gotten is north versus south. That's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. Separating out the form-based aspects to be considered separately from either of the geographically focused portions of the article also makes sense to me. I'm not sure I was necessarily understanding all of what you described there, but it sounded like you were maybe proposing that the form-based aspects would have application outside, not just in the areas that we're talking about here, but would apply to other existing areas as well. So that could be potentially problematic in terms of a fairly large expansion of the scope of what we've been looking at and talking about. So that would be something to think about. That was just my initial concern on hearing that. I do agree with the separation. I do like the idea of incorporating TDR, although I think we'd have to do some homework. It sounds like you've already started doing some homework on that, which I appreciate. And it would make sense probably to consider that separately, but we'd also have to think about the interrelationship. You know, if one part depended on another, make sure that we structure it such that they're independent of each other in terms of being separate articles. But I think that's a reasonable approach going forward. Bruce?
Can you give an example of what this might involve? I'm vaguely aware of this concept, but this would mean if somebody owned land outside a village center and they were able by the current zoning to do a subdivision, that they would say, well, I don't necessarily need to do this subdivision if I'm given permission to build in a village center. Is that correct?
So, for instance, you could do it as simple as if you can build 10 houses in an RO district, you could buy that development and then you would be able to build 10 houses in some other district by just transferring the rights, 10 houses that you wouldn't otherwise. So if you had a 10-acre lot where you're allowed to do 10 houses, and then in the receiving zone you might have a 5-acre lot where you can do 10 houses. You can take those other 10 houses from the sending zone, put them in the other one, so now you can do 20 houses, for instance. But since our village center zones are not, they don't have specific, you can't count how many units you could put in necessarily. So the way it appears that the way their density is regulated is by lot coverage. So I would suggest something like protecting an acre of land outside in a sending zone. You could increase the lot coverage by 10% on an acre of land in the receiving zone. Or if you protect 2 acres in the sending zone, you could have 20% in an acre of the receiving zone, something like that, some scale like that. So then you can cover more, and then presumably you can put more units on that in the area that we wanted.
What would happen to the original property then? It just wouldn't be developed at all?
Right.
Would it continue to be owned by that person, or would it revert to the town ownership, or how would that work?
There are ways of doing it. It would be you could buy an APR, or you could buy a conservation restriction, or something where it's put in trust and it cannot be developed.
The way the TDR works is you're essentially taking the density or some portion of it from one property away from that property. Just in the same way that with an APR, you're buying the development rights on the property, and thereafter somebody owns the right, a public entity owns the right to develop the property, not ever going to exercise it. So it's severing and breaking up and moving around the pieces of the right to develop the property. It's a lot easier to do TDR where you have a fairly unencumbered area that you're transferring land from, and a fairly unencumbered area that you're transferring density or development to. And at Atkins Corners, for instance, that's sort of tailor-made in some ways for a TDR, a fairly simple and straightforward TDR arrangement. In North Amherst, it could certainly be done, but it would be a great deal more complicated because you're sending it to areas that in many cases are already developed, and you would need to figure out what percentage. You might not, for instance, find a circumstance where you would have a piece of property in an outlying area on which you could develop X number of units, and find a place in the receiving area where all of those X units could be received. It might instead be some percentage of increase over what would be the default requirement, but below some maximum that established a control over how big things got in the village center. It's a really good idea. It's a very useful tool. It can be very complicated in practice, and so it's worth looking at. But I agree with Jonathan that what we should do is have it as a sort of a companion piece, tracking this, so that it could be voted on and considered separately. And we'll see whether or not it's ready, for one thing, by the time we get to town meeting.
Chris?
It is one of the things that you suggested to PVPC that you might be able to use their help on. So if they decide to offer you the help, you could choose to use it for that. Oh, sorry. Yep. The planning board was invited by Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, as were all towns in the region, to submit requests for technical assistance. This was a few weeks ago. And the planning board, one of the requests that our planning board made to PVPC was for help in the area of transfer of development rights. So PVPC recently wrote back to the planning board and said that they were going to be able to offer, I think, 3 projects. I don't know if that meant 3 projects in the entire region or what it meant, but anyway, if Amherst were to be able to receive help from PVPC, that is one of the areas where PVPC could be helpful to us. That's all I was suggesting.
John?
I would say, and I think we're dealing with it with the parallel tracking method, but I would just add to caution already voiced about adding to the complexity of things, that there are all kinds of really good ideas and really good things that we can add to stuff, but I think that the most important thing is to create a workable set of form-based regulations and a workable set of zoning district boundaries for the 2 village centers. And the other issues we can consider in parallel, but we need to keep enough separation so that we can proceed with the things that are workable and ready when the time comes.
Did you have anything else, Rob?
No, I'll send my notes to people.
Sure, thank you. Bruce?
Chris had,
I just had a question about how, for any of you, how you envision separating the form-based code text from the map. So would you just eliminate all references to North Amherst and Atkins Corner from the text and then put in some generic language there, and then later on perhaps insert something that was specific to a particular area? Did you have an idea about that?
I did, yes, and it's very similar to what you just expressed. I think that going forward with the ability to work on the article, we were constrained last time because the proposal to make those changes came after the warrant had already been signed, and so making any of those changes would have involved a hugely complex amended motion. But we don't have that constraint now. We can write the text the way we want it. So I think that it will be possible to go through the article and do as you suggested, remove the areas that are particular to a specific geographic location, and then separately in another article that pertains to North Amherst specifically, go in and amend those sections to add in the language that would pertain to North or South Amherst or whatever other area we were talking to. I don't think that'll be easy, but I think it'll be possible.
There are, in the way it is laid out, there are very specific form-based regulations that apply only to North Amherst and only to Atkins Corners, and those could be, they're enumerated and so forth. Those could be set, could be tracked in, again, in a separate piece, and language added to the main regulations, as Rob was saying, that would apply to the center districts that we have, the mixed-use districts we have, the general business district, the village center business district, the neighborhood business district, and so forth. The BL districts adjacent to the general business district in that way. I think we need to look at the regs to assure ourselves that they are in fact general enough to work in all of those instances. That one of the reasons why they are the way they are is that they arose out of the village center public process for the two village centers. But I think it's a very good approach.
Okay. Anyone have anything else on village center rezoning? I'll turn to the audience if anybody has comments or questions for us or to us on any of the items we've talked about. Ms. Fitch.
I'm just curious, there's a handout here that says suggested amendments. What is that from?
That has been prepared by staff as potential areas that we can look at making changes to the article. So we haven't talked about that, and
It'd be nice to hear what those are.
sure. Beyond what's listed there, you mean?
That would require I read it.
Right.
So if you could walk us through it, then I might be able to comment on it.
Sure. I'd actually prefer at this point not to do that, because the approach that I'd like to take is to follow the process that I laid out earlier, which is to talk about what everybody's issues and concerns and ideas and suggestions are, and to move ahead and generate something new. And I think that, and I appreciate the work that staff has done in putting this together, but to me it represents more of a what can we change what specifically can we change in the existing article to make it better respond to some of the concerns that we've heard. And I guess my approach would be more to have a reset of the process and to try to build consensus around a new article rather than going through with a scalpel to the existing article. I mean, what we end up with will be based on the framework that we have here already. But I'm picturing something a little bit more than just crossing out a few items and making a few changes here and there. So like I said, I appreciate having that as a set of guidelines, but I don't think that we're in the point in the process where we should be talking about it at that level of detail yet. I hope that satisfies your concern or answers your question to some degree.
Without having read it, I didn't know that it was just kind of little.
Yep.
Versus bigger ideas.
Right. So we're a public body and we have to do everything in a public process. And so what I've laid out here in terms of my idea for how we should conduct our business going forward is the first time that we've talked about this. And the list of amendments that we have that from staff was made outside of a knowledge of that process, because we haven't yet discussed it or talked about it. So we've got kind of two parallel tracks going on here. Yes. If you have a quick question, you can yell it out. If you have comments, I would ask you to use the mic, because it should be wired into the speakers and people will hear you a little bit more easily.
I have three questions relative to the discussion that's going on tonight, which I found very interesting, the separation of pieces of the original article. Anyway,
Can I interrupt you? I haven't been enforcing my desire for people to introduce themselves, but please do.
my name is Joan Burgess, 36 Mount Pleasant Street. My first question actually goes back to another result from the previous town meeting where the consulting, the money for a consulting agreement for a market analysis was approved. And my question about that is, are we going to move forward on that quickly enough so that any information that comes out of that analysis could be used to sort of form what we might do for the spring town meeting with regard to form-based zoning and the Atkins and North Amherst projects? Because it seems to me that that could be providing us some key information as to what our needs are for those two projects.
It could, and I don't know the timing of that because that's not something that we're working on. But I will tell you that my insight would be that that would be unlikely to take place and to have results available in a fashion that would be timely enough for us to use it going into our work on this process. Because really we would have to have something in January or February for us to use it in a meaningful way. And I don't think that the timeline for working out that study would proceed as quickly as that. I stand to be corrected if staff has more insight into it, but I just don't see things moving that quickly.
No, I agree with that, that it might well be done in time for town meeting, and that is the intent, to help inform sort of the end of the process, but it won't be available for the beginning of the process.
Okay. My second question is with regard to Mr. Crowner's suggestion about separating the form-based code from the zoning issues. Do we have any examples of that kind of those kind of articles being passed in other towns where the form-based zoning, the form-based code is really generic, and then that sits on top of zoning changes? Because it might be interesting to see how other people may have done that.
Unless I see hands shooting up at the table here, Rob can.
Yeah, I
address
don't
that.
know specifically, I can't remember specifically, but there are towns that have adopted generic form standards and applied them to the whole town or to areas of town without changing zoning. Yes, that does happen.
Okay.
And I'll look that up and pass the information along to staff.
Okay. And my third question is a concern, really, that separating these articles and going forward and coming up with a brand new one is a fairly large task. And my question is, do you think it's feasible that we can do that without having another consulting agreement to have help in doing this, or is it something that the committee can do by themselves?
I believe that it's something that we can do, and with a great deal of assistance from the professionals that are sitting next to us. Yes, I think that we can do it. As I said earlier, that the consultants' main roles were to facilitate the public process of getting community input and to provide us with technical expertise on how form-based codes work and how other people fit them into their zoning bylaw, because we didn't have any experience doing that ourselves. So we do now have a template for how to do that, for how it would work within the context of our zoning bylaw. We understand it in much more detail than we did going into the process. So yes, I do have a fair degree of confidence in our ability to take what we've got and to put together something that will work.
Thank you.
If it turns out we're wrong about that, then we'll have to make other plans. But I do think that it will work. Ms. Keller. Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to recognize Ms. Keller. But
Janet Keller, 120 Pulpit Hill Road. I want to acknowledge and thank you all for the hard work that you put into this and into Article 17, and that you still have energy to start working on proposed revisions. And I want to especially thank you for stating your intent to work with us in a collaborative way. I very much appreciate that. So to continue along the idea of how will the process work, will it be possible to get the new articles together with a good bit of leeway in front of the Springtown meeting and enable hearings on the final draft of any major pieces so we can really give it a good go-round? Is that going to be possible given the time frame, and could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I do think it will be possible. I think we'll need to do a lot of work to make that happen. But that's part of what I was trying to it's part of the path that I'm trying to take us down in terms of being more organized with our scheduling, to have a sense of what the key dates are, when we need to make the key decisions about when things need to be scheduled and what the deadlines are, so that we can do exactly as you suggested, which is have a final draft early, not be looking to make changes to that draft, have a public hearing on the final draft itself, and to have all that happen well in advance of town meeting. We're very much aware that people had concerns about the timing and the sequencing of things for fall town meeting, and that's sort of a technical issue that doesn't need to be a problem if we are organized and disciplined in our work. So yes, I do think that we can do that, and as we get closer to it, we'll talk more specifically about what the steps are in the process and what the specific deadlines are that we're dealing with. But we already know that the select board is going to sign the warrant on the 30th of March. What that means is that the language is final for the warrant on that date, and that we can't make changes to it after that. So our intention would be, and we've already outlined that our meetings before that would be on the 21st of March and 7th of March. So somewhere in that time frame, I would want us and the planning board to be making a decision in terms of, are we done with this? Is this the final article? Is it ready for the warrant? And if it's not, then we pull the plug on it, because we can't, in my opinion, we shouldn't go into town meeting with something that is big and important, and that people are going to be, again, having concerns about the timing and the sequencing of things. So I want us to be well prepared for it, and if we're not well prepared for it, I would not be supportive of moving forward with it.
Great. I have my usual concerns, so I'm not going to go into those. You know what they are, but you know my concerns for the natural, historic, agricultural resources, and I'll be asking you for some analyses of those impacts. But new thing that I've not expressed is, will you be able to give us, and I'll be asking you for this, the maximum allowable build-out for the area or areas proposed for rezoning, and a fiscal impact analysis for that? And I say that because I'm aware of the town's very legitimate concern for the structural deficit and its desire to, in part, to rezone in the hopes that more property tax revenue will be generated. And the concern here is that will that revenue be net revenue? Will it be a net benefit? So will there be time to include that kind of analysis?
Excuse me. Typically, that sort of economic analysis is done more at the project level than it is at the zoning level. That's not something that we encode in the zoning bylaws themselves. It's typically something that a board like our board would consider in the process of looking at a proposed project. But that the differences between a specific project being proposed and zoning, which is just the enabling legislation that lets projects happen or not happen. So we typically don't get into that kind of analysis when we're looking at zoning changes. We would be looking at that more when we approved or didn't approve a specific proposed project. Mr. Tucker.
What we could do is look at some, a sample property and say, based on the dimensional regulations in the form-based code, this is how big a building or buildings could be on this property. Then you have to get into the question of, well, what are those buildings filled with? And since this is deliberately a mixed-use village center, we can posit different, maybe 3 examples of it's this percent of this use and that percent of another use, varying, and then do a very gross analysis of the kind, using assessor's records and so forth. That will give you some sense of scale. But it's a fisherman's tale in terms of what you're really looking at, because we don't know what uses would fill those areas. And in many cases, and in most cases that I'm aware of in the history of projects in Amherst, they end up being smaller than the maximum coverage for a variety of reasons having to do with the site, having to do with financing for the project, having to do with things that they discover when they get in there on the site and didn't know about in advance. And so all of that would be hypothetical, but we could do some sort of gross cuts like that. Understanding, we'll put lots of caveats on them, that they don't really represent what will happen on those properties. They give you some sense.
Could I just do a follow-up, because this, I think, relates to that. If a village center would be considered a smart growth project by the state, are there state funds to help with infrastructure, with, say, if there would be new streets or new sidewalks or street lamps, that sort of thing?
Talk.
Increasingly, any state grants for anything are tied to smart growth. So to the degree that this zoning goes through and represents smart growth, then a number of things become automatically more eligible for funding than they would otherwise be, and Amherst's village center, whichever village center that is in a better position to compete for what is increasingly a limited pool of funds for anything in terms of state grants than other communities that are not pursuing that. So, yes.
Thank you.
And finally, I would just like to ask if there will be allowance of time to look into the results experienced in similar towns that have adopted similar zoning to what we'll be contemplating.
Sure. So we've already done some research into other communities that have adopted form-based codes. So in terms of providing specific examples of things that have been built there, is that what you're?
I'm thinking more deeply than that, actually getting to talk with town officials and business people and residents in places that have adopted similar zoning, and how has it worked out. It's been my own experience when I worked on Main Street zoning back in Providence and advocated for that Main Street zoning, which is of course a form-based code, that some of the things that got built pleased us very much, and some of the other ones were not as, didn't conform to the code as much as we would have hoped. And it's very useful to see how that plays out in order to address anything that you learn from that process. You know, if the lawyers in that law building really don't want to have apartments over, or however it works, if they don't like the fenestrate, if they don't like the way the windows are arranged, that sort of thing, you can kind of figure out what is it that's getting in the way, or what's really working well.
So yes, we will do our best to try to
Yeah, that would
gather
be
that
great
type
if
of
you
experience.
could.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Ms. LaCour. I'm sorry, Ms. LaCour, I told or implied that.
Side first. Go.
Okay, go ahead.
As long as we have time at the end.
You're next, Ms. Perot.
Sarah LaCour, Precinct 9 and W.D. Coles, North Amherst. A couple of things. One, I'm looking forward to moving again on this quickly. I was hoping you weren't going to sideline it. So I think that's exciting. And one of the things I would like to, and this goes back to Ms. Keller's comments, it's important to think about rezoning, not necessarily just in terms of increased tax revenues, but on looking at the investment opportunities it creates for private investment. Yes, the town has a structural deficit, and there are issues with how infrastructure is paid for. The town was just turned down for a PWED grant to improve Pine Street. So, the town cannot do all the infrastructure improvements it wants. Therefore, it needs private investment to do so. But private investors, and I'm not speaking about the Puffers and the Coles Joneses at this point, any private investment in this town needs incentive. They need a reason to come in and build and help us reinvigorate and revitalize our town. And rezoning can help do that. And so, private investment coming in from out of town is critical, and rezoning is critical to that. So I think that needs to be kept in everybody's minds, that there are really valid reasons for rezoning. And I love the TDR. TDR works wonderfully in many, many communities, and I think it's a great idea. But you need to make sure you are allowing that density in your village centers if you want to move it from somewhere else. And again, you're creating projects that are actually viable for private investors to come in and build. Thank you.
Ms. Perot.
Melissa Perot, Summer Street. I suppose my main question, fundamental question, is what is the rush? We rushed through the last process, and it proved unsatisfactory from everybody's point of view. And I wonder what the rush is now. It seems to me that development can go forward with the existing zoning. And I would like to see us get this right for the future, not for the pennies now. So I wonder why this couldn't take a little more time, why we couldn't get the market analysis, which after all we paid for the housing, and which a specific question was asked at town meeting, is this for the whole town? And the answer was yes. And if that is the case, we should wait for it. It doesn't make any sense to put out $40,000 and then ignore it any more than it makes sense to put out $40,000 to have a charrette and then ignore what that has to say. So please take your time and see whether if this could not actually do better if we worked on it for longer and worked with people more, especially in the North Amherst area where there are a lot of concerns and there is a very large area that you're proposing to rezone. I don't think Amherst, I don't know because I'm a new resident. Oh, one of those people who are being kept out, by the way, by our closed drawbridge, and was welcomed enthusiastically into the community. There's no difficulty in coming into North Amherst if you want to come. We need to take the time, we need to take the effort to work with each other and collaborate, and not to have another map presented to us that is yet again something that we feel immediately arouses a sort of no response. Didn't you hear us? I was very disappointed with that. Let's do it right. Let's talk. Let's listen. Let's work together. We all have good ideas. We all have good intentions. The developers here are going to do good things. I'm quite sure of it. Laura Fitch is an excellent architect. I like what she does. The Coles have good intentions for the town. Why wouldn't they? You know, us residents are on Montague and Summer Street and Pine Street. We want a better village too. I don't think it's a money-making venture in the present. I think it will be in the future if we do it right, if it's a sustainable community. I'm not sure that what we're looking at right now is sustainable into a future that we don't know very much about, except that it is surely going to go downhill a little bit economically. So please take your time and see if you can perhaps do this over a longer period. We've been at it hammer and tongs for the last 3 months. And although you still have the energy to go on, I think it's not wise to take a break, look at things more thoroughly and clearly. One of the things is that we could do a survey to see actually who are this density that you keep wanting to put in there in order to make a viable village center. I believe they're there. The fact that they're in the community around and not in a townhouse on the spot doesn't mean that there isn't a market for services and businesses in the area. Let's find out. You've got a market housing analysis. Why not let's find out about a business analysis? Who would use it? Let's find out who wants it and what they want. And give some confidence in going forward with businesses and apartments on top. Because that's the kind of mixed use that we want. And it's the kind of mixed use that you want. So let's do it right. Let's not rush forward. Bob Crowner had some good ideas about breaking things up. Well, let's start with Atkins Corner. It's not such a complicated area. It doesn't already have existing businesses, residents, as much as North Amherst does. Why not go forward with Atkins Corner this spring? And wait a little bit, do a little bit more work with the North Amherst area, and let's get it right. If you need a success, go for Atkins Corner. There doesn't seem to be a lot of negative feedback that you've got from that area. There is room to develop that. There is no density there. So please, take Atkins Corner, and please go ahead. Try out the form-based zoning there. It might be a very good way to show people that this can work, that this looks good. Give them confidence to go forward with it. Or try it on the town. I don't know why the villages have to have it if your town doesn't have it. Seems to me it should start there. But anyway, please go slower. Please start with Atkins Corner, and please give us more time to do the research and the information gathering that we need to in order to get the fundamentals in that village, the Mill River, the historical buildings. Those things need to be taken care of. Let's take care of things first, and then think about how we can go forward in a much more collaborative sort of way. I don't want to get into this fight again where you present something, we say no. You present something else, we say no. Let's do something together. And I like very much the idea that you put forward that we have a roundtable discussion. I would hope that that kind of discussion would go on a more ongoing basis over the year. I think it could, and I think it should, because that's the kind of thing that makes a town work. It works together then. We've all got energy, we've all got ideas, we've all got skills. Let's make us all work together, not just the board against people. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. I appreciate your desire for a collaborative process and communication. And I hear that, and that's the path that I'm trying to take us down. So I hope you don't feel that we're not trying to go there, because that is what we're trying to do.
But it's just the push and rush to get this
Right.
going where I don't think it's appropriate.
So-
I do think it's appropriate for Atkins Corner.
So thank you for that feedback also. In my mind, the biggest motivating factor for wanting to move ahead with this is the big orange blotch that's on the zoning map right now covering big portions of North Amherst for the, sorry, I didn't put it there.
Actually, town meeting put it there.
No, it's been there for about 40 years now, which is the commercial zoning that's in place there. And I know that we've heard feedback from you previously that you think that commercial zoning is great and all kinds of positive things could happen under that zoning. I don't happen to share that view. I think that that's not an area where commercial zoning is appropriate, and there's a wide range of things that could potentially be problematic for that village center that could go in there under the existing zoning. And today we have no control, no meaningful control over the types of uses that would be permitted there, or the layouts and the forms that they would take, or really any aspect of the development there. So you've got,
Form-based zoning on top of it.
I'm sorry?
Not even with form-based zoning.
There is no form-based zoning now.
But if you had form-based zoning on top of the existing zoning.
So that's a possibility. So we could talk.
Commercial that's so devastating, it's the commercial without the form-based.
The commercial zone that we have in place now has no form-based controls. Nothing has form-based controls really in our bylaw, and it has the widest range of permitted uses of any zoning district in our bylaw. That's a cause of concern for me. Maybe it's not one that's widely shared in the community, but I think that commercial zoning, the only other major area where we have commercial zoning applied in town is along College Street, the Route 9 corridor leading east out of downtown toward Belchertown. That's the example of what commercial zoning is really designed for. It's not designed for village centers. It's not designed for mixed-use housing. It's designed for really intense, automotive-focused commercial activity. And I have great concerns about what could go in there. We've got a big piece of property with a developer who wants to do something and get some value out of their land. And if there's all sorts of things that could be proposed there now that we would have much less control over than we would have with more rational set of zoning for the area. So what that zoning is, we need to talk about that and we need to figure it out. But why we need to move ahead in my mind, is because the existing zoning is unsatisfactory. That's not a great situation for the village center there. So I think that it's important that we do something to try to make it a better zoning situation there so that we get the kind of growth and development and changes that all of you have been telling us that you want for a long time. Quickly, I mean, I don't want to get into a back and forth, but you asked the question of
Okay,
why we need to
commercial,
move ahead.
All right. Change your commercial. Why do you have to attack the RN part of it?
What we do going forward is a subject of discussion. I don't think anyone's attacking anyone. So we all need to talk about what we think is appropriate, inappropriate. We're never going to have a situation where everybody's happy. So we need to try to build something that, well, I've not seen many situations relating to zoning where everybody walks away happy. But we try to craft something that's acceptable and positive and valuable. So that's why we talk to each other. So let's leave it at that. Mr. Fox.
John Fox, Bering Street, Precinct 10. First of all, I do want to thank you as well for really wanting to re-examine this. I think Rob Crowner's suggestion of separating these things may be very viable. I do want to confirm the notion that we ought to go a little more slowly than we have in the past, and because I'd like the next time something really important comes before town meeting to be able to embrace it and that it really does pass. And so let me just begin with a few questions. What do you understand the consultant who will be paid up to $40,000 is going to provide us? What will be useful out of that consultant's report that we're looking forward to?
With regard to this zoning project?
Well, what do you understand the consultant is going to do? And to what extent do you think...
Talking about the market analysis?
Yes. Yeah. Can you explain what do you think this market analysis is going to produce that might be useful for the town?
Mr. Tucker.
As was explained at town meeting, and the reason that I believe town meeting adopted this would be looking at two things or two aspects of the housing market in Amherst that other ongoing studies which are looking at a broader and more generic set of indices would not. This would be looking specifically at the recent impacts of student housing on the conversion of single-family residences in Amherst. And this would also be looking at, and that would be a historical analysis, and this would also be looking at the potential housing market in Amherst for residents other than students. And by that I mean undergraduate students. In Amherst, people always ask me the question about the population. Well, how many people are students? And the answer is about 98% of the population are students of one sort or another. But we're really looking at people who are not undergraduates, who are not the young folks who are populating our apartment complexes and so forth. We're talking about grown-ups. We're talking about at least the three demographics that were listed in the information provided at town meeting. We're talking about baby boomers who are retiring and moving out of their suburban homes and into more central urban areas where they can walk to services. We're talking about their children who are forming their first households, and many of whom appear to have the same preferences in terms of location. And we're also talking about single adults, principally women, but single adults generally, who are forming households, sometimes with children, sometimes not. This would look at Amherst, it would look at the region, and it would look, by that I mean Western Massachusetts, and would also look at the New England region in terms of market analysis and try and determine whether or not people are trying to move into Amherst, and we believe, based on anecdotal information, that they are, and are failing consistently to find housing that meets their needs, and who it is that is doing that, if we can identify those folks, and then what it is that people are looking for as a housing product. What kind of housing are these folks looking for that is not being provided in Amherst now? And that could help inform the way in which We manage the town's housing programs. It could inform future zoning. It could inform a lot of things. We believe we have a reasonable handle on the demographics now, or we wouldn't be going forward with things like this, both on the basis of anecdotal information, which is considerable and consistent, and on the basis of the regional trends, which are obvious and which analyses of which are available elsewhere. But we want this to be a targeted, professional, detailed analysis so that the next time we go around on any of these things, we have real answers to people's questions.
So that leads me to the question, why would you rezone before you have that market analysis? If you're describing something that is so important to inform future decisions about housing, what this potential population, which could be really attracted to Amherst, might want, why would you rush forward in the spring to adopt, say, form-based zoning, which I think may be very useful, but why would you rush to that if you have just said that the information that could be provided by this consultant could be very, and you hope will be very useful to inform all sorts of decisions, including future zoning?
So
Why would it not be important to get that consultant's advice, conclusions, question the consultant and the rest before you come before town meeting with a new zoning proposal that would extend from north, in North Amherst and South Amherst and maybe other town centers?
So I think I already laid out a fairly compelling view of why it's important that we move ahead with this. In the future, when we have the results from the housing study, it will make all of our decision-making that much better. But we've made zoning decisions in the past without having that information. Everything we've done up till now has been made in the absence of that information. As Mr. Tucker indicated, we have consistent and compelling anecdotal evidence on lots of issues, and we want to have a more professional, more thorough view of it going forward. But I think that it's a mistake for us to tie our hands and not do anything until we have even more information when the facts on the ground right now are unsatisfactory.
So just one other question on the consultant. When do you expect the consultant's conclusions, findings, et cetera, to be available, looking forward?
As soon as we can get them. I can't
I mean,
give you
but are you talking about by town meeting in spring?
hopefully, yes. We're
So-
going to try to do that, whether or not that is
Right.
possible.
So just one possibility in your consideration of these things is that you would postpone until the fall town meeting the presentation of change zoning, which would give you and the entire town an opportunity to incorporate the wisdom that you would hope to be there in that consultant's report in whatever you do. Now, if it's so urgent that you can't wait 3 months or 4 months or 5 months, then of course you'll make a different decision. But I would encourage you to think about that again. If we're going to spend as much as $40,000 at this time, it's quite true we've acted before without this, but we now have this consultant who's coming in. So I would ask you to consider that. Then on form-based zoning, what I'm unclear about, and I think a lot of people are, is this basically what was in Article 17? Is it taken off the shelf? So if you went from town to town that has form-based zoning, you'd basically see the same thing. Or were there choices made that you looked at different form-based zoning articles and you said, well, this looks good, this is not so good? So is it a generic? Is basically we would take whatever you have proposed and we could go to other towns with form-based zoning and say it looks virtually the same?
So no, that's not the case. So what we proposed in the fall was based on the feedback that we got from the community during the charrette that we did, and attempted to try to incorporate the aspects of what's there today that people want to keep and preserve and encourage. That's unique from town to town. Every town, even within parts of a town, those aspects will vary. So every town has its own way of doing things, and no, I think that you would find significant differences from one town to another.
So would there be a way for you to post what sort of the important choices that you made? Because here are some of the different ways that different towns have approached form-based zoning. We chose, Section A rather than B and C for the following reasons, so that we'd have some sense of the choices that were before you, and then we can understand better what you rejected, because we know what you accepted, but we don't really know what you rejected. So some sense of what others might have chosen, so we can think along with you. What did you reject and why? And and so that's a general question or request. And specifically, it would be that broad exception that I wrote about, which says that that whatever is written into the form-based code could be ignored if there were good cause. And I'm wondering whether you could let us know whether that's uniform throughout form-based codes. Is it written that way? Do some form-based code communities reject that? If they do, why? In other words, how does that play out? As a lawyer, I could understand writing that in, because you want, if a really good case comes before you and you feel you're hemmed in and you'd like to do something that would be useful, I understand why you might want that. On the other hand, I'd like to know, and I think a lot of people would like to know, well, how is that played out where it does exist? So does it end up being really useful? Or are some communities saying, boy, I wish we didn't have it, but we can't get 2/3 to change it? So that exception seems to me important, and so some explanation of that. Then two other things. The notion that zoning, that your responsibility is totally independent of the revenues that might be generated from change zoning is troubling. I understand that you're not the revenue-raising people, but for you not to actually have some sort of alternative budgets or something that you can present as possibilities emanating out of changing the zoning that could produce net revenues for the town of so much would be relevant, because if there's going to be a lot of these changes and you haven't even thought of, because you felt it's not within your purview, what those changes what impact they will have on revenues. Will they be revenue generating? And under what formulations would they, and under what formulations might they not be? That seems to be very relevant to the decisions about how we might change zoning, because I think we do have to get additional revenue, but I'm not sure how. And I'm not sure the best way to do it. And it'd be really useful for you as working with the financial people to find out, to suggest to us what would work best in taking into account lots of these things. And then finally, it does seem to me, and this was mentioned, and I mentioned it in the article, there was enormous value when the Amherst Redevelopment Authority went to Hanover, New Hampshire, went to Storrs, Connecticut, really met with the town planners, with the town officials, the developers, the people who were in Storrs. They'd worked for 10 years on a redevelopment, and they still didn't have it. They still didn't even have leases from the major, because from the major potential commercial people that would come in, the retailers and the rest, because it's tough. So it does seem to me that it would be very useful for the planning board, for all of you, actually to go to some of these sites that seem most relevant to Amherst and to ask those questions. What have you done, and what has its impact been? What would you change if you could change? What works best? And I think you end up being informed better. So I would encourage it. I think you'd really like it. What the Amherst Redevelopment Authority did was invite citizens to go along. They announced it when it was, and a lot of us went along. And it was really educational. It was really useful to talk to the zoning people, the planning people, the town officials. So I encourage you to do it. I think it would be useful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Ms. Fitch. And I'll ask you to be brief because we do need to wrap up pretty soon.
I just actually wanted to answer the question from my own perspective about why you might want to do them parallel, market analysis and zoning change. One is that the market will change. I mean, that's like death and taxes. I mean, it's a given. So I guess, in my perspective, I want the zoning that's sort of most flexible to market change, and that mixed use versus just simply commercial, to me, does feel more flexible. And also the market folks might say that, you know, we got a great market for this, but if the zoning isn't there on the ground, then that market won't be delivered. And just from my own, conversations that Barbara Puffer and I have had about her own properties, not knowing actually what the market would be, and considering, do we hire somebody to do a market study for her? And her sense was, well, I don't want to spend that money until I even know if the zoning's going to change. So it's sort of they what comes first, the chicken or the egg? I think it's really appropriate that they're both going forward, and I'm glad this work is being done.
Thank you. All right, that's about all we have time for tonight. Thank you all for your comments. And we look forward to seeing you again on January 4th and future meetings. The one other thing that I wanted to mention schedule-wise that I forgot to bring up earlier was to talk about the zoning forum for the next time around as part of planning ahead. In the calendar that I handed out, I included through the end of June, and I penciled in the June 20th as the date that would sort of fit into our normal schedule. It doesn't need to be scheduled and posted yet, but just to get it in our heads as to when we'd like to do that so that we have advance warning and notice of it. So if that date works for everybody, let's decide on that.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right.